Holt had been drifting alone for 11 months when his scanner started screaming. Not the soft, lazy ping of debris tumbling through dead space, not the polite chime of a comet or a rogue rock. This was a Class 9 mass alert, the sound reserved for capital ships, collapsing stars, and things no sane person ever wanted to find this far from civilization. Jolted awake from a half-sleep in his pilot chair, spilling recycled coffee across the console. He didn't wipe it. His eyes locked on the readout and refused to move. Mass signature, enormous, roughly 4.2 kilometers stem to stern. Hull shape, angular, wedge forward, aggressive in the way only warships were designed to look. Hull composition, titanium ceramic alloy, Terran manufacture, late 23rd century. His survey vessel, the Swake, a tin can bolted together by the lowest bidder for Meridian Survey Group, had just detected something that should not exist inside the drift, 700 light-years past the last registered human navigation beacon. Typed the specifications into his registry search with hands that had started trembling somewhere between the mass reading and the hull material. The database loaded, then went quiet in the way databases go quiet when the answer is something they were never supposed to return. UHCS Unconquered Sun, humanity's first true deep space warship, first of her class, only of her class, 3,248 crew, lost with all hands at the Battle of March 14, 2244, declared destroyed, case sealed, war memorial erected on Earth's lunar surface, granite and gold listing every name. Declared dead, declared gone for 81 years. Pushed back from the console slowly, like a man trying not to startle something he didn't yet understand. He pressed his palm flat against the cold viewport and stared out into the drift, that ancient, slowly churning ocean of gas and dark matter that no shipping lane ran through and no military patrol ever bothered with. The kind of place that swallowed things and kept them. The shape materialized from the haze the way nightmares do. Gradually, terribly, too large to be real and too detailed to be imagination. 4 kilometers of warship, dark except for a single amber light blinking in slow, rhythmic pulses from deep within its belly, far below the shattered bridge towers. Amber, the universal signal for emergency power. Auxiliary systems, bare minimum function. Something on that ship was still running. And then, before could breathe, before he could think, before he could make the rational decision to turn his little survey ship around and leave this to people who carried guns and had training and weren't alone, the scanner chimed again. Not the alert this time. Something different. A response signal. Active, directed at him. The Unconquered Sun had detected the Swake. And it had answered, spent 4 hours on the approach thinking about leaving. He calculated it seriously, the jump window, the fuel cost, the exact sequence of commands that would spin the Swake around and push it back toward human space at maximum burn. He ran the numbers 3 times. He had everything he needed to go. He kept flying toward the Unconquered Sun. He told himself it was professional obligation. Survey techs were required to document anomalies. He told himself it was the signal. He had to verify the signal, log it, report it. He told himself a lot of things. Deep down, somewhere beneath the logic and the fear, there was a simpler truth. The ship was calling to him, not with sound, with weight, with the gravitational certainty of something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to come. The ancient docking collar on the Unconquered Sun's port flank was designed for a different era's ships, but the magnetic interface was Terran standard, and the Swake slid home with a dull, definitive clang that echoed through his hull like a verdict. He pulled on his EVA suit, checked his oxygen, clipped his survey stunner to his hip, and stood at his own airlock for a full minute without moving. Then the other ship's airlock opened on its own. Not a malfunction, a deliberate cycle. The inner seal released, the outer door swung back, and emergency lighting flooded the corridor beyond in long amber bars. Walked through before his better judgment could reassemble itself. The smell reached him first. Cold metal, machine oil aged into something almost sweet, ozone sharp enough to taste, and underneath everything, smoke. Old smoke from fires long extinguished, still embedded in the walls after 80 years of. The corridors were military-wide, built to move armored soldiers in formation, and they made feel like a child who had wandered into somewhere he wasn't meant to be. The scorch marks on the walls told a story he didn't want to read. Long arcs of plasma scoring, the kind that came from directed energy weapons fired at close range. Craters punched in the deck plating by something that had entered from below. A section of ceiling had collapsed entirely and been welded back with the rough urgency of emergency repairs done under fire. Whoever had fought their way through these corridors had not had an easy time of it. He found the first body 22 meters in, still in full combat armor, still upright, slumped against a structural strut with one gauntleted hand raised at chest height, fingers curled as if holding something that was no longer there. The suit's external display, miracle of engineering, still had a trickle of auxiliary power from the ship's core. Crouched and read the name on the breastplate, Corporal Shen, 1st Assault Division. Died defending something, died where he stood. Straightened and made himself keep moving. He passed 2 more bodies in the next 100 meters, both armored, both fallen in positions that looked less like surrender and more like they were still trying. The silence pressed against him from all sides, not the peaceful silence of empty space, but the thick, held-breath silence of a place that remembered sound and had never forgiven its absence. He was almost to the main corridor junction when his wrist terminal buzzed. He looked down. The armor log reader he used for old survey equipment had activated on its own, pulling data from Corporal Shen's suit via proximity signal. A log line was blinking on his screen, the last entry in the internal movement record of a dead soldier's battle armor. The timestamp was not 81 years ago. It read 12 minutes ago, stood absolutely still for 6 seconds. Then he drew his stunner, checked the charge, and reminded himself it was rated for Category 4 hostile fauna on jungle worlds. Whatever was on this ship, if it had a nervous system, he could drop it. He kept that thought close. He kept moving. The sound found him before he found its source. A voice coming from the direction of the command spine, from the deep interior of the ship, past 2 more junctions and a blast door that had been wrenched open with something approximating mechanical violence. The voice was low, measured, and spoke in standard with an accent that pulled at a memory couldn't quite place. The clipped, precise cadence of early Terran fleet training, the kind they stopped teaching 2 generations ago when the war protocols changed. Survey vessel broadcasting on Terran Guild frequencies. You are inside a restricted military zone. Identify yourself and state your operational purpose. His heart was doing something complicated. He pressed the transmit button on his suit's comm and heard his own voice come out steadier than he deserved. My name is Holt. Survey Tech, Meridian Group. I'm alone, no military affiliation. I picked up your ship's mass signature and your response beacon from the drift. He paused, a beat of silence in which the entire galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Who am I speaking with? 15 seconds of nothing. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, utterly unafraid. The footsteps of someone who had been the most dangerous thing in this corridor for a very long time and saw no reason to change that. A figure emerged from the deep shadow at the far end of the passage, passing through the amber light in sections. Boots first, then the charcoal uniform of a United Human Command officer, then hands that moved with the quiet intentionality of someone who had once known exactly where every weapon on this ship was and probably still did. Then the face. A woman, tall, lean in the way endurance creates rather than genetics. Short silver hair swept back without ceremony. Dark eyes that had seen too much and processed all of it into something hard and still and absolutely present. She carried herself the way mountains carry themselves, without apology, without effort, without the faintest suggestion that anything in the universe had the right to make her feel small. She stopped 8 meters from him, close enough to see, far enough to evaluate. My name, she said, and her voice filled the corridor the way voices fill cathedrals, is Captain Sira, commanding officer of the UHCS Unconquered Sun, United Human Command Deep Strike Fleet. She tilted her head, looked at him the way a person looks at something they've been waiting for and aren't yet sure whether to trust. And you, Holt, are the first human being I have encountered in 81 years. Lowered his stunner slowly. She looked 50 years old. She moved like 50. The kind of 50 that has been carved by decades of hard use into something that bends without breaking. He pulled the ship manifest from memory, the Unconquered Sun's command roster, standard fleet record, publicly archived. Captain Sira, born 2201, Ganymede Station. Missing in action, 2244. Missing in action, 43 years old when the ship vanished. She should have been 124 years old. She should have been bones in a memorial file. She was standing 7 meters away from him in a dead warship in the absolute middle of nowhere, and she looked like she could still pass a combat fitness evaluation. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. You look, he started. I know, she said, and something moved behind her eyes that might in a different light have been grief. Come to the command deck, I'll explain what I can. She turned and walked, boots ringing on the plating. And bring whatever food you have on your ship. Ration packs here ran out 14 months ago. She made him coffee. Real coffee, vacuum-sealed single origin from Titan's greenhouse belt, the kind that cost more per gram than's monthly fuel allowance. The stores had been sealed in military-grade preservation canisters, and the drift, she explained, had been very good to sealed things. He drank 2 cups before he realized his hands had stopped shaking. Captain sat across from him at the command deck's briefing table, a surface covered in handwritten star charts, printed calculations, and what appeared to be a journal composed in 3 different pens across what must have been hundreds of hours. She folded her hands on top of the papers and began to explain things with the patience of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times, speaking it aloud to an empty room, hoping for the day when the room would not be empty. The drift is a gravitational fold, she said. Not a standard gravity well, something older and stranger, a place where spacetime has been creased by forces we don't have names for. Our instruments in 2244 had no way to detect it. We flew into it mid-battle, mid-burn, with 3 main drives at overload and our forward shields already failing. She pulled a chart toward him, hand-drawn but extraordinarily precise. Time inside the fold moves at approximately 1/40th the rate of standard space. For every 40 years that pass outside, 1 year passes here. Did the arithmetic slowly, the way you do when you already know the answer and don't want to arrive at it. 81 years outside, he said. 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days inside. She said it without flinching, the number of a person who had counted every one of those days and made peace with the counting. I have had a great deal of time to verify the calculation. And your crew? Dead. The word landed flat, the way words land when they have been spoken so many times they've been polished into something smooth. Most died in the battle before we entered the drift. The offensive was devastating, and we were outnumbered 8-1. Those who survived the battle died in the first 8 months here. The ship's medical systems maintained me. I believe it was a combination of the drift's time dilation and an emergency medical protocol that was never intended to run for 2 full years. She looked at her hands, strong hands, capable hands, hands that had buried people and then had no one else to help bury. I was not supposed to survive. The protocol was designed for 30-day scenarios. Looked around the command deck. The walls were covered floor to ceiling in handwritten logs, daily entries, technical calculations, astronomical observations. A full crew roster was pinned beside the main viewport, every name printed neatly. All but one had been crossed out with a single horizontal line. The last name remaining was hers, and next to it in different ink, older, shakier, written on what must have been a very bad day, 2 words, still here. He felt something crack open in his chest that he didn't have a name for, didn't try to name it. You maintained this ship alone for 2 years, he said. I maintained what I could. She's a tough girl. There was genuine affection in his voice when she talked about the ship, the complicated love of a person, and the machine that had refused to let them die. The drift preserved the hull integrity better than I could have done manually. The reactors ran on automatic cycling. I kept the systems I needed alive and let the rest go dark. Why didn't you try to leave, navigate out of the drift? She looked at him steadily. I did, 14 times. The drift's geometry resists exit from within. You need a precise approach vector from outside. I calculated the correct vector on my 219th day here, but I needed something outside the drift to lock onto. A beacon, another ship. She paused. I needed someone to come. He sat with that for a moment. The image of her, alone on this enormous dead ship, working the numbers for 2 years, calculating the exact trajectory that would set her free, waiting for a ship that might never come. What were you fighting at? He asked quietly. What actually started the battle? Set down her coffee cup. Her jaw tightened. Something moved behind her eyes, not fear, but the controlled look of someone holding back something urgent with disciplined hands. That, she said, is the reason I need to reach human space immediately, not tomorrow, not after we rest. Now, she stood, moving to the viewport, staring out at the swirling dark of the drift. Because what I found in here, what I've spent 2 years figuring out, changes everything. The war, all of it, she called them not the chorus, not the silence, not the outer dark, the names humanity had layered onto them over 50 years of terrified propaganda and desperate rebranding. There was their actual designation, recovered from a data core had pulled from a disabled enemy vessel in the final 12 minutes before the unconquered sun fell into the drift. She had spent 2 years decrypting it. She had spent another 6 months of her personal time refusing to believe what it said. Everything we were taught about was wrong, she said. She was at the holographic table now, calling up tactical files that flickered with age but held their shape ghost-like maps of a half-century of human encounters. Every engagement, every incursion, every quote-unquote attack, we were reading them backward. Leaned over the table. The maps showed engagement vectors, every point where human ships and forces had clashed, going back to the first contact in 2198. He had seen these maps before. Everyone had. They were taught in schools, displayed in war museums, used to justify 3 generations of military expansion and weapons development. The red lines always came in from the outer systems, always pushed toward the human core worlds, always retreating when resisted. They were pushing us inward, said. Hurting, every attack, every pressure campaign, they were moving us toward the core systems and away from the outer drift sectors. She highlighted a vast region of space far beyond the drift, hundreds of light years of uncharted territory, dark and ancient and unexplored. Away from this. What's out there? A signal, she brought it up. A waveform, complex, layered, repeating on a cycle that she had calculated at precisely 11,412 years. I found it in month 7. It was embedded in the drift's background radiation, invisible unless you knew exactly what harmonic to isolate, which I didn't until I'd spent 6 months analyzing the core data. She let him look at the waveform. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are very, very old and have been doing the same thing for an unimaginable amount of time. It's not. It predates them. It predates every species we've ever. Straightened, you're saying they weren't attacking us. I'm saying they were protecting us, or protecting something from us, possibly both. She closed the tactical display. The distinction may be academic. What matters is that 3,000 people on this ship died and a 50-year war was fought and an entire civilization spent a century in fear, all because we couldn't read the difference between a shepherd and a predator. Her voice did not break. It was too controlled to break, but it came very close to the edge of something vast. All because we shot first. Sat with the silence, and the signal, have you? Responded to it. She didn't look at him. Yes. He felt the back of his neck go cold. When? Day 206. I spent the preceding 40 days deciding whether to. In the end, I decided that if something had been broadcasting a signal for 11,000 years, it deserved an answer. She finally turned, and it answered back. His voice came out very quiet. What did it say? Picked up a physical printout from the table, a single sheet, worn soft from handling. She placed it in front of him. 4 words translated from a language he didn't recognize into standard. Precise, careful, unmistakable. We remember your kind. That was 14 months ago, said. Since then, the source of the signal has been moving, toward us, accelerating. She pulled up the trajectory projection on the table's display. The line from the signal's point of origin curved smoothly, inevitably, toward the drift. At current velocity, it will arrive at the edge of this drift in approximately. The proximity alert screamed. Both of them looked at the sensor board simultaneously. Something had just dropped out of whatever passed for faster-than-light travel at the very edge of the drift. Enormous, slow-moving, and radiating an energy signature that matched nothing in any database either of them had ever seen. The object that emerged from the outer edge of the drift easy description, which was why stood at the sensor display for 3 full minutes trying different ones and discarding all of them. It was large, larger than the unconquered sun, larger than any human-built structure that existed outside of planetary engineering projects. Roughly 4 kilometers at its widest point, tapering at both ends into shapes that suggested, but did not commit to forward and aft. It was dark, nearly invisible against the drift's background haze, except for a deep internal luminescence that pulsed in slow, complex rhythms, different colors bleeding into each other in patterns that the rational part of his mind kept trying to categorize as language, and the rest of him kept insisting was something that came before language. It moved with the unhurried, absolute confidence of something that had never needed to hurry. It came to rest at 50 kilometers from the unconquered sun with a precision that no known propulsion system could have achieved, no deceleration burn, no compensating thrusters, simply a decision to stop and an immediate, total stopping. And then it radiated something. Not heat, not electromagnetic interference, something that had no entry in any physics textbook had studied, but that his body understood immediately in the same primitive way it understood fire and darkness. A presence. An awareness, immense and patient and entirely focused, in a way that made the inside of the command deck feel like the inside of a room where something very significant was paying attention. "It's not transmitting on any standard frequency," said, running the sensor sweep twice, 3 times, her face lit from below by the display. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were enormous. "Not radio, not laser comm, not quantum entanglement burst. Nothing I can record or measure. It's simply—" She stopped, looked at the display like it had said something rude. "It's here, that's all the sensors can confirm. It's here and it's aware." Then neural implant activated. Not the way implants activate when receiving a standard comm signal. That was a sound, a notification, a tiny chime behind the ear. This was different. This was the implant being used by something that understood its architecture better than its manufacturer did, something that had looked at the device embedded in Holt's skull and decided it was an adequate medium for a conversation. Impressions arrived in him not as words, but as fully formed feelings with the density of words. The warmth of sunlight after a very long winter. The specific ache of recognizing a face you had given up hope of ever seeing. A curiosity so vast and so old it made his own curiosity feel like a child's drawing of the sea. And underneath all of it, gentle and inexorable as gravity, a question. Not spoken, not transmitted, understood the way you understand your own name. "What have you become?" Turned to, she was watching him with an expression that mixed professional composure with something very close to awe. She could see from his face that something was happening to him that wasn't happening to her. The ancient thing had chosen him. The newcomer, the accidental one, the man who had stumbled into this moment while dead nebulae for a company that paid him barely enough to care. Why him and not her? He didn't know. Perhaps because she had already answered, she had sent the signal, she had made the first contact, she had done her part. Perhaps because whatever this was, it wanted a fresh witness, someone who hadn't had 2 years to prepare an answer. He looked back at the sensor display, at the vast, patient thing 50 kilometers away. At the pulse of its deep internal light, which he now noticed had slowed to match his heartbeat in a gesture that was either coincidence or the most intimate thing anyone had ever done to him. "What have you become?" Before he could answer, the secondary sensor panel chimed, looked at it. Her face changed, the iron composure cracked open along a single seam, and something raw came through. She said, "They're patrol vessels, the ones that have been holding position at the edge of the drift for the last 6 weeks. She looked at him. "They've gone." Felt a cold that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature. The most dangerous non-human military force in the known galaxy, the species that had pushed humanity into a 50-year defensive crouch, had just quietly and completely vacated the area. Not fled, not retreated under fire, simply stepped aside with the deliberate courtesy of someone yielding the floor at an event they had been preparing for a very long time. Because what was arriving did not need their protection or permission. Holt stood in the middle of the command deck of a dead warship in the heart of an ancient drift at the edge of explored space, with 50 kilometers of something older than human civilization pointed at him like a searchlight, and understood with absolute clarity that no training in the galaxy had prepared anyone for this moment. The proper first contact protocols required a diplomatic team, a division, a fleet escort, 8 committees, and about 4 years of preparatory documentation. He had a survey stunner and 11 months of solitude. The question hung inside him, immense and patient. "What have you become?" He pressed the transmit point of his neural implant, the physical contact that activated outgoing communication, though he had no certainty it would work in this direction, no certainty anything he did would transmit anything to anything. He thought about what to say. He tried composing something diplomatic and dignified, the kind of response that would represent humanity well, the kind of answer that would make the species proud if it was ever played back in a history archive. He tried several versions of this in his head. All of them felt dishonest. All of them felt like dressing a wound in a very nice uniform. So he told the truth, the only honest answer a person could give to that question about that species at that moment in history. "Complicated," he said, "but we're still here." Silence. 7 seconds of absolute silence, during which became aware of his own heartbeat in a way he usually was not, each beat feeling loaded with more significance than it had any right to carry. Beside him, had gone so still she might have been carved from the same titanium as the ship's walls. Then the ancient thing laughed. It wasn't transmitted through the implant. It was transmitted through everything. Through the hull of the ship, through the deck plates under his feet, through the air and the cold metal and the recycled atmosphere of a vessel that had been silent for 81 years. A sound that wasn't exactly sound, more like the sensation of sound, the feeling of something vast and ancient experiencing a genuine, unexpected, completely unguarded moment of delight. The kind of laugh that comes from a place deeper than amusement. Recognition, relief, the laugh of something that had asked this question of many species across many and had never quite gotten that answer before. The luminescence inside the ancient vessel shifted, every internal light brightening simultaneously from the deep blue of waiting into something warmer, more golden, more present. And then every sensor on the command deck lit up at once. Moved to the board with practiced speed, her eyes cutting across the readings, her hands pulling up the tactical overlay. She was already talking before the picture was fully assembled, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone trying to process something that required recalibrating every assumption they held. Fleet contacts, 17 vessels, destroyer class and above, dropping back into normal space at the outer edge of the drift. She looked at him. All 17, in formation. A pause. They're not targeting us. Looked at the tactical display. The ships hung in perfect geometric pattern at the edge of the drift, not a battle posture, not a retreat formation. Something else. Something that took him a moment to recognize because he had never seen it before, had never heard of it being documented. They were facing the ancient ship, all 17 of them, aligned, still, the posture of something that acknowledges an authority higher than its own, not submission but recognition. Respect offered freely by a species that had never offered it to humanity. "They're here as witnesses," said very softly. "That's why they never left. They weren't guarding against us reaching this. They were waiting to see if we would." The implant pulsed again, not with a question this time, with a feeling that translated, imperfectly but unmistakably, as an invitation. And beneath it, layered deep in the impression, the way a signature is layered in the bottom corner of a painting. A single additional piece of information, offered the way you offer something to someone you have decided to trust. A name, their name. Not the firstborn, that was the name would give them later in reports and conversations, and the book he would eventually write and never quite feel was adequate. Their actual name, offered now, which could not be rendered in any human language but which translated in feeling as something very close to, we who were here when the stars were young. Pressed his hand flat against the viewport glass, the same gesture he'd made on the swake when he first saw the amber light blinking in the dark. He didn't know why he did it. It felt right. The ancient ship pulsed once deeply in perfect synchronization. It took 6 hours for and to bring the unconquered sun's drives back to operational capacity. Not all of them. A warship designed for a crew of 3,000 could not be fully crewed by 2 people, and they did not try. They brought up what they needed: navigation, main drives, the communications array, and the jump drive. In the quiet urgency of that work, something shifted between them. The 2-year gulf between the last human she had seen and the first human she was seeing now narrowed into something more ordinary. 2 people with a job to do and the competence to do it. Worked the drive systems with the ease of someone who had reread every technical manual on the ship twice across 2 years of solitude, and who had fixed things alone that were designed to need a crew of 20. Patched his survey vessel's communication array into the unconquered sun's main transmitter to amplify the signal. His hands shook a little. He didn't mention it. She noticed and didn't comment. That was its own kind of kindness. Between tasks, they talked to the ancient ship. That was the only word for it, talked, though the communication moved in impressions and emotional resonance rather than language, and though the depth of what passed between them in those 6 hours would take years to fully articulate and a lifetime to fully understand. He would learn in fragments and feelings a story that spanned geological epochs, a species so old that human civilization was a recent event in their biography, who had moved through the galaxy like gardeners move through an orchard watching species grow, failing when they reached too far too fast, occasionally enduring to something different, something worthy of conversation. The it emerged were not a conquered species or a client race. They were something closer to colleagues, the most recent species before humanity to have passed whatever threshold this was. They had been the guardians of this meeting point for 4,000 years, keeping younger, louder, more dangerous civilizations away from something they were not yet ready for, not out of cruelty. out of the particular compassion of those who have seen what happens when the contact comes too early, when the knowledge breaks the vessel that tries to hold it. Humanity apparently had been close for a while, closer than they had expected, which was why the war had been so restrained. Every engagement calibrated to push rather than destroy, to test rather than eliminate. When it sent her signal from inside the drift, it had been the final data point. And when it answered the question with that single, unrehearsed, utterly human response, complicated, but we're still here, something had been confirmed that no diplomatic mission or formal delegation could have confirmed as cleanly. That humanity understood its own nature. That it could look at itself clearly and not flinch and not pretend. When the drives were ready, stood at the helm. Her hands rested on controls she hadn't touched in over 2 years of her own time. Around her, the command deck came alive in ways it hadn't since the battle, consoles brightening, navigation arrays spinning up. The deep familiar thrum of a ship preparing to move traveling up through the deck plating and into the soles of her feet like a greeting from something that had been waiting to be woken. Settled into the co-pilot station. He had piloted survey vessels for 11 years. He had never piloted anything with this kind of mass, this kind of history, this kind of weight. He ran the pre-jump checklist the way he ran every checklist, methodically, completely, without shortcuts. "Ready for jump calculation," he said. Looked at him, a long look, the kind people give when they are deciding how much of something to allow themselves. Then, quietly, something crossed her face that had not been there when he had first seen her in the amber-lit corridor. Not happiness exactly, but something in happiness's family. Something earned at a cost most people would never be asked to pay. "Plot them yourself," said before she could offer. "You've been waiting 81 years, the seat's yours." She entered the coordinates, human space, Earth's solar system, home. Behind them, through the wide viewport, the ancient vessel pulsed once in slow, golden light, a farewell or a beginning or both, offered in the only language old enough to hold both at once. The 17 ships at the drift's edge held formation, still and witnessing. The unconquered sun lost, grieved, written into granite on the lunar surface with 3,000 names, bent spacetime and jumped. 11 days later, the emergency beacon had broadcast from the ship's modified communications array reached Earth. Every government relay station, every military listening post, every civilian emergency channel on the planet and across every colony in the system received the same burst transmission simultaneously. It was not encrypted. It was not classified. It was not addressed to any authority in particular. It was addressed to everyone. The message was 12 seconds long. It contained a ship identification code that made every database it touched treat it like a ghost. It contains voice, steady now, steadier than he had ever been in his life. And it contained 4 sentences that would be quoted, debated, and eventually carved into stone on 3 different worlds for the next 500 years. This is the survey vessel's wake, broadcasting from aboard the UHCS Unconquered Sun. She's coming home. All 3,000 names are accounted for. And she's bringing guests, so clear the docks, because they've been waiting 10,000 years for this introduction, and I don't think we should make them wait any longer. 3 hours later, the first diplomatic vessel, escorted by the ancient ship, moving at a pace that felt almost ceremonial, dropped out of jump at the edge of human sovereign space for the first time in recorded history. Its communications array broadcast on a frequency no human ship had ever used. The message it carried was a single phrase, translated through 2 years of linguistic work into imperfect but unmistakable standard. "We were never your enemy." Somewhere in the drift, the ancient light pulsed one final time and went dark. Not extinguished, resting. Patient. The way something rests when it has done what it came to do and can afford to wait for whatever comes next. And somewhere on a lunar memorial wall, 3,000 names waited in cold granite to be read by someone who finally knew the whole story.